Welcome to The Secrets of Success. By following the proven techniques of the guests who appear on this series, you'll learn that even successful people run into detours and failures, and how you can apply their success techniques to change your life.
You're now listening to the most unique show on radio, the show dedicated to making you a success. Can your mindset change your world? David Robson says yes. David, thanks for being with us today.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
David, you've written a book called The Expectation Effect. Can you tell us how this book came about?
Yeah, sure. I mean, as a medical journalist who had been writing for magazines like New Scientist and The Guardian, I'd always kind of been aware of the placebo effect and really fascinated by it. But it's actually a personal experience of a phenomenon called the nocebo effect that really got me interested in expectations more generally. Now, the nocebo effect is really the opposite of the placebo effect. It's when your doctor, say, warns you that you're going to have some side effects, and because you expect to become ill, you start feeling ill. And I happened to experience that for myself when my doctor prescribed me some pills, and she told me that I might expect to experience some bad headaches as a side effect of those pills. And sure enough, I really did feel this incredible pain that lasted for a few days. And it was, so bad, it was really difficult for me to continue with my work. But I just happened to be writing about the placebo effect at the time for my job. And I came across this discussion of the nocebo effect. And I realized actually that was probably what was causing my headaches, was the expectation rather than the actual action of the drugs. So just that realization really helped to relieve the pain. So it's incredibly powerful.
And first of all, I've never heard of that before your book, and I know it now because I read it in the book, the nocebo effect. We've all heard of, I think most of us, the placebo effect. And I guess as we go through the interview today, you'll fill us in on more. But it's interesting that you had that personal experience, because what can be better than that? You lived it and you've been there. Am I right? I think I read in your book that our beliefs can actually affect our body weight, the consequences of stress and insomnia, longevity, heart disease, and I think even you talked about people's birthdays, how that almost controls, in some instances, their day of death. Am I correct?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Our expectations can have all of those effects. And that was what I really discovered after I'd kind of experienced the expectation effect for myself, just with this one kind of experience taking these pills. Actually, then I looked into the literature, and I was so surprised to find that there's like a ton of peer-reviewed, good scientific evidence showing that our expectations are having all of these effects on our lives, right up to our longevity. Kind of how quickly we age can be shaped by our mindsets, which was so incredible. That was really what made me think like we need to have a book on this, because it's profoundly shaping our lives.
Now, The Secrets of Success, our show, has been on for 33 years, and we talk about positive thinking and the way you think and mindset. But your book is coming at it from a medical viewpoint, and it's a very interesting read, because I'm not a medical person, but I'm reading it, and I'm amazed by what I'm reading in there, and how you are actually bringing out what we've talked about in generalities, but now doctors and medical professionals are using this in caring for patients. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's absolutely it. So, I think I differentiate it from kind of positive thinking in the fact that we are talking about very specific effects here. So specific expectations about specific effects. But like you said, it's also completely grounded in the medical literature. So we know, all of these physiological mechanisms that can lead to these effects. And like you said, doctors are now really trying to use that to enhance the effectiveness of their existing treatments. So, placebo pills can't replace traditional kind of conventional medicine, but actually using the placebo effect can be really helpful in making sure that patients get the most out of those treatments and to ensure they have the best experience possible while they are being cared for by a doctor.
Were you really amazed the first time, as you mentioned, when you found out about this and when you started getting in, the more you got into it, was this almost like going behind the scenes and finding out how magic works?
Yeah, it really was. It was kind of incredible. And actually, that's what a lot of the researchers told me when I spoke to them, was that, in the past, we've seen these kinds of expectation effects almost as this kind of magical thing, these kinds of miracles almost. But actually, now is the time to kind of move away from that side of thinking. We know they're amazing. We know it does feel miraculous, but actually now is the time to practically put it to use, because we've done all the good science to show how we can go about using it.
Have you found doctors and medical personnel, how are they accepting this, or are they? Do they say, "Oh, that's not science, I'm not going to deal with it," or are they very accepting because it actually helps them in their work?
No, they're incredibly accepting, and actually I think the majority of doctors, and that there are surveys that showed this, the majority of doctors actually are really aware of these things happening with their patients already. So they're, very much aware that the kind of language they're using with their patients can have an effect. I think what's exciting now is that in the past it was always morally dubious about whether you could deliberately use a placebo effect, because if you're giving someone a sham treatment, that involves deception, which is ethically dubious for a doctor. But what's amazing, and this was one of the things that really blew my mind while researching the expectation effect, was that you can actually get a lot of these benefits with total honest communication. So, for example, there's some amazing studies looking at open label placebos, which sounds like an almost contradiction in terms. You give patients a bottle of pills and tell them that they are placebos. But alongside that, you also explain about how the placebo effect works, the power of the mind-body connection. And then the patients go away, they take the open label placebos, knowing they're placebos, and they still experience a profound relief from their symptoms. So things like chronic pain, can be treated with these totally honest placebos. So that's what's really exciting doctors actually now, is the fact that, they will be able to use all of these expectation effects in their medical work without having to worry about the ethical consequences of that.
That's so amazing. I'm just going to repeat it because I'm sure someone hearing it may not have picked it up in its entirety. You're saying that a doctor or a medical professional can prescribe a placebo, a fake pill, so to speak, that what we know, almost a candy type of object, telling us it's a placebo. So we know it's not the real pill or the cure-all, whatever. And yet that pill can help a certain percent of us, or maybe all of us, with a particular pain or illness or symptom. Did I get that right?
Yep, that's absolutely right. So this has been shown in all kinds of illnesses. So things like chronic pain, it can help to relieve people's allergies. It can help people who are suffering from fatigue. They can't help every single illness, but certainly amongst these illnesses I've mentioned, it's really powerful. And actually, the study that really stuck out for me came from Portugal, where this team of doctors were treating these participants with chronic pain. And they found that over the course of a week, these open label placebos reduced their symptoms of pain by 30% compared to people who were just continuing with their usual kind of treatment as normal. So 30% is the kind of threshold for the clinical significance of a treatment. Is the kind of bar that you would set for any kind of new drug, new treatment. And these open label placebos were passing that threshold. And even more amazingly was that they found that 5 years later, when they followed up, these patients were still faring better. It was almost as if understanding about the power of the mind-body connection and the brain's ability to kind of control their pain, that itself was empowering them so that they could carry on using that learning. They had a different mindset that was still beneficial 5 years later.
That's amazing to me, because 30% is a big number. I started out my career as a math teacher, and if I have a pain and someone can reduce it by 30%, that's significant, and I would be very happy, or say the doctor was successful in treating it or working with it to get it down. Some pains just aren't going to go away completely, but if you can knock off 30% of it, that's a significant number. One of the quotes I took out of your book, you say, our minds are not passive. They can actually change reality. And that's what you've seen. Am I correct?
Yeah, that's exactly it. I mean, that's what we're seeing here with these kind of open label placebo treatments. Now, I should say also that, say, something like pain, you could consider that to be subjective, but we also understand the physiological mechanisms here. So when someone has the expectation of having pain relief, what you can see is that their brains are actually increasing the production of chemicals called endorphins. They're kind of endogenous opioids. So the brain has its own kind of painkillers. And when you offer someone the expectation of pain relief, their brain actually starts to make those painkillers. So it's almost like it's kind of harnessing its own inner pharmacy. And we know also there are other kind of objective changes that are happening when people receive these kind of heightened expectations of recovery. It can change the blood pressure, for example. It can change the action of the digestive tract, and it can also reduce inflammation. And we know that inflammation within the body lies behind lots of illnesses and can often exacerbate kind of chronic conditions too.
David, I just wrote down that term, inner pharmacy, because I think it's so apt to what your book is about. And I'm going to give our audience some information, which we do on all our shows, but on this one especially, I'm going to urge them, start taking things down, because if you have a friend who has pain or experiencing it, or you yourself, and we don't know, it could come tomorrow, it could come a year from now, you're going to love this book and want to know what David is writing about. David, at this point in the show, I remind our listeners that you're listening to The Secrets of Success on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. I'm Bill Horan. Our guest today is David Robson, R-O-B-S-O-N. His book is The Expectation Effect. And David, we're going to ask you, is there a website where we can learn more, and where can we get the book?
Yeah, so you can definitely get more information from my own website, which is www.davidrobson, that's ROBSON.me. You could also go to my publisher's website, Henry Holt. And you can just buy the book from any major booksellers, really. So Amazon online, Barnes & Noble, basically anywhere you get your books currently, you can buy my book too.
And I want our audience, I'm going to repeat it because, again, it's so important to people if they're not feeling well. The Expectation Effect by David Robson, R-O-B-S-O-N. We'll give you that information again later in the show if you didn't get it down, but please just put it down someplace. I'm sure within the next week you're going to be talking to someone and they're going to say, oh, if my sister and my son only knew about that. It's definitely going to help a lot of people. David, I took a term out of your book, and the term was prediction machine. Now, where does that come into play? And I know the neuroscientists refer to this, but I want you to explain it.
Yeah, so, I mean, the idea is that the brain acts as a prediction machine, and this is this big new theory of consciousness within neuroscience. So it's it's very important for lots of different reasons, but actually what's especially powerful about this idea of the brain acting as a prediction machine is that it can also help us to understand why expectation effects occur. And the idea here is simply that the brain is always trying to simulate the world around it. So, it can get plenty of information from all of our senses, but then the brain is trying to use that data to kind of build a more detailed simulation. And it's actually changing its processing of that data using all of our past experiences, what it's expecting from the context, all of these things. So that's just the way the brain works. It's actually fundamental at kind of every level of the brain's processing. But while it's building these simulations and trying to kind of preempt what's going to happen to the brain and the body, it also starts preparing our physiology. So it starts, changing the levels of our hormones, changing our blood pressure, releasing those neurotransmitters that I mentioned, just to make sure that we can be as adaptable as possible. And essentially, this is the mechanism of the expectation effect. When we have an expectation, say that a situation is going to be better than we believe or worse than we believe, that's changing these simulations, and subsequently is then changing the way the body prepares for the challenge ahead.
And I know you have some examples in the book, and one of them, it hit all of us because we've all gone to the doctor and they said, here comes this needle. And most times they say, you're going to experience a little pain. And sure enough, and I think you've said that, or the section of the book, that when a doctor or a nurse says that, we actually do experience more pain. If they didn't say anything, the pain tolerance or the pain experience is actually less. Is that true?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So I think the reasoning behind the doctors kind of giving you that warning is sound, in that they don't want you to feel kind of surprised when you do feel it. But actually, there are ways that they could provide that warning that would not sound so scary or frightening. So just saying something like you might experience a little discomfort is less likely to produce this kind of a heightened pain than if they tell you this is going to hurt. So there are definitely ways that we can frame messages that can reduce these effects. And I would actually say that increased pain that you described, that's just another example of the nocebo effect that I spoke about earlier in the show, really. It's just another example of when the expectation that we're going to experience discomfort, that actually then increases our discomfort.
It almost seems like the social sciences are starting to move over into the medical science in terms of how we experience it. Last week, we had a guest on who was telling us people who listen to 10 seconds of a doctor speaking, just in general, could actually predict at almost a 70% rate which doctors would be sued for malpractice. Which this was just them talking about something, not making an errant statement, just in their conversational tone and the words they used. Now we're learning that just by what the doctor or the nurse says can actually help us in experiencing less pain or more comfort when we're at the doctor's office. Do we come into a doctor with biases and maybe perceptions that if there's a pain in my foot, it's going to hurt, or my knee or my back? Is that something we all do?
Yeah, that is. And actually, I did read this amazing case study. It's just one example, but of someone who had to go into the emergency room because they had a kind of nail. They'd stepped on a nail that had gone through their shoe, and they were in agony. Now, when the doctors cut the shoe off, what they found was that the nail had actually, amazingly, had just gone through the gap between their toes. So it hadn't pierced any flesh, and the person had no injury at all. And as soon as they found that out, this agony just evaporated. But before they went to, having assumed that actually they had this terrible injury, they were experiencing this really real pain. And I think we can all kind of empathize with that. I think more generally, just like we do have this kind of white coat syndrome that when we're going to the doctors, we're kind of scared of becoming ill. And actually that can then exacerbate some of our kind of discomfort. It can make us feel nauseous. It can make us feel kind of, if you're worried about a kind of respiratory infection, it could kind of make it harder for you to breathe. So, we do know that actually the anxieties we have around medicine are really important for then contributing to people's difficult symptoms that they might experience.
I know I copied down in your book, you say we're often poor judges of our own abilities, and it's possible to push the limits of what we can achieve through our mindset. And I started thinking of that like in the physical world. If we go to a gym and we can, to use an example, press 100 pounds, I guess if we go for a few weeks and work with a trainer, most of us are going to be able to press significantly more, at least at the beginning. Then the increments might be smaller. But it seems like what you're saying, our mind can actually work almost as a muscle and help in the cure and comforting us through any kind of illness or pain or discomfort that we might experience.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And actually, the mind is so incredibly important actually in determining our performance when we're exercising. What I came to realize when I started researching the expectation effect is that actually, our increases in performance at the gym, as you described, that's actually as much about recalibrating the brain's expectations of what the body can achieve, as much as actually changing things like your muscle mass. So there's really good evidence for this, but one of the best comes from studies of imaginary exercise. So this is where doctors don't actually ask the participants to do physical exercise, but just to imagine they're doing exercise for a few weeks. So every day they might kind of visualize in enormous detail kind of lifting a really heavy object. And what they found was that actually those participants are stronger at the end of this kind of trial of imaginary exercise. So without actually lifting the objects, they are about 10% stronger than they were at the start of that. And what's happening there is just that the visualization is helping to recalibrate the brain's expectations of what it can do. So it's sending more signals to recruit more muscle fibers during the exercise. So even though the muscles aren't bigger, you're actually recruiting more muscle fibers, and that gives you that extra burst of strength.
So when we hear people telling us about visualization, there's a medical background to it, because again, I'm just going to repeat what I understood, if I'm correct. Just not going to the gym, but just by mentally picturing doing the exercises and perhaps going through it, people have increased their strength and what the weights they could lift by up to 10%.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And it sounds amazing, but actually this has been replicated many times. Now, obviously, I'm not saying that we should just imagine doing exercise and that we shouldn't go to the gym. The best thing, obviously, is to do both, to actually use that visualization to kind of help you to boost your performance at the gym and to make it more comfortable, so you're more likely to keep going back, and so you just find the whole experience a lot more pleasurable. But it could also be really useful for rehabilitation. So when athletes suffer from injuries and they can't practice, actually doing these visualizations can be really useful to make sure that they don't lose the strength in those limbs while they're kind of resting them and allowing them to be treated. So it is of real practical use across the spectrum, really, for kind of casual exercisers right up to top athletes.
David, once again, I want our audience to know, and hopefully they're sitting there with a pencil or a pen, that they're listening to The Secrets of Success on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. I'm Bill Horan. Our guest today is David Robson, R-O-B-S-O-N. His book is The Expectation Effect. And I'm asking you to copy that down because before we ask David some more information, you're going to want to tell people about this. There's a lot of amazing things, and these are all documented. It's not just pie in the sky. David has done the work. He's a medical journalist. He knows about this stuff. You'll find this book fascinating and probably make your next trip to the doctor, to the hospital, to the emergency room a lot less painful and a lot more acceptable. David, can you tell us where we can get the book and the website?
Yeah, sure. So it should be available in all good bookstores. So Barnes & Noble, online you can buy it at Amazon. And you can find out more from my own website, which is David Robson, ROBSON.me.
David, did I understand that just the way things are labeled makes a difference? Maybe the way they appear to us, a pill or a medication, or the labeling on them? And if I'm correct, can you expound on that a little bit? Yeah,
that's definitely true. So, I think we're all kind of familiar with kind of the top brands of, say, painkillers. What the research has shown is that actually if you give people placebo pills within, those branded boxes, that the placebo painkillers are much more potent. They produce a greater reduction in symptoms compared to if you give someone placebo painkiller that is not in the kind of branded packaging. If you tell them it's a kind of generic, cheap medication instead. Things like branding, advertising, they have an enormous effect on the size of the placebo effect, and as a result, actually, on the effects that we get from the drugs that we're buying. Because what we know about most medications is that for every medication, there'll be like a direct biological route for the relief that they're giving, but that will then be augmented by a placebo effect as well. And when you're getting the kind of branded medications, you just have a bigger placebo effect component to that treatment.
Patients with the most positive expectations tended to show the quickest recovery. How would you talk to people if you were kind of the greeter, let's call it that in a medical office, a new term, someone coming in? How would you advise them to react after their procedure or their operation? Is it watching funny TV shows, reading a funny book, just reading positive statements, or what would you say to them?
All of those things can definitely help. And actually, there's a lot of research showing that humor can, when we see something funny, when we laugh, that actually helps us to release those endogenous opioids, those endorphins that can reduce pain. So absolutely, humor's incredibly important within medicine. But I actually think just the kind of conversations that health professionals have with patients can be incredibly powerful within their own right. And we know that that's true even if the health professional isn't actually administering a treatment at the time, that just some encouraging words can help to reduce people's symptoms and improve recovery. So we've seen that for things like rashes. When someone goes to their family doctor with a rash, often there's nothing really that the doctor can do to reduce the rash. But if the doctor says, this is nothing to worry about and it will go down on its own and you should find relief soon, that the rash will actually go down and that it will stop itching so badly more quickly than if the doctor just doesn't give you that reassuring message. Similarly, there was a study looking at how empathetic and warm family doctors were to patients who'd come in with the common cold. And they found that if the doctor, again, if they gave these reassuring messages and just acted like they cared about the patient, but also then reassured them that it was nothing to worry about, that they actually recovered from that cold about a day earlier, so 6 days rather than 7 days. And you could see differences in objective measures of immune activity. So the immune system was just kicking into action a bit more quickly and a bit more powerfully when the doctor had given those reassuring words. So I just think throughout healthcare, we need to be thinking really carefully about how we can optimize these conversations.
And it's definitely great you telling us this. Now, I'm guilty of the next item I read in your book. I guess worst case thinking. Somehow if we prepare ourselves for the worst case, I guess we feel that anything that happens almost has to be better than that. But you actually say that worst case thinking actually promotes the worst case. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, this is very much true. I think, so many people in our culture, and I was definitely one of them, we kind of assume that if you're kind of pessimistic, you're maybe being a bit more rational. And we associate kind of optimism with maybe being this kind of Pollyanna figure who's not really seeing the world the way it really is. And, there's a certain logic to that, but actually you are potentially making things a lot harder for yourself. And I'll give just one example, but the one that really spoke to me when I was researching the book was looking at the effects of anxiety and stress. And I think there a lot of us are very negative about when we feel anxiety. If we've got some challenge like public speaking or an exam and we start to feel anxiety, we start to be very defeatist and we see the anxiety itself as a sign that we're going to fail. Now, the research shows that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, that by assuming that the anxiety is a sign of failure, we actually make it more likely that it will harm our performance. So the researchers just told the participants who were students taking this really difficult graduate exam, they just told them, actually don't fear your anxiety. Actually look at your anxiety as your friend, because we evolved anxiety for a reason. The body's responses when we feel anxiety are actually really useful. Your heart is beating hard because it's pumping oxygenated blood around your body to your brain to sharpen your thinking. So actually the anxiety doesn't have to be debilitating at all. It can actually be enhancing for performance. And what they found was that just telling the students this message actually then did help them to perform much better on the exam. And that's now being replicated in lots of different contexts. So, people doing public speaking, for example, in sports games, and also some of the kind of life challenges that we have, if you're made redundant, that actually having a more positive view of stress and anxiety and almost seeing them as a source of energy can actually be incredibly beneficial.
You've done so much for all of us today. And again, before I wrap up with you, I want our audience to get that pencil out and remind them our guest today, David Robson, Robson, the book, The Expectation Effect. And David, would you tell us where we can get it in the website?
Absolutely. So Amazon, Barnes & Noble, basically any bookshop where you would normally get your books. And you can find out more from my website, davidrobson.me.
David, thank you so much for being with us today. I'd like our audience to know that you've been listening to The Secrets of Success on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. I'm your host, Bill Horan, asking you to please join us again next week at the same time when we will continue our journey to success.